Welcome everybody. Sorry, a bit of audio difficulties there. Welcome everyone to the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship final for 2020. Obviously, we had big plans to be in the lavish New Zealand Parliament, which unfortunately haven't been able to accrue. But we are now in the lavish online Zoom room, which is a good second best alternative. What's going to happen today is we're about to get a debate from two excellent teams, and then after that, there'll be a prize giving. On to the teams. The two teams that made it to the final of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championship. I just dropped out, so I'm moving to the second device. This is the joys of online debating for those who are uninitiated. So the teams are Auckland Blue and Auckland White. So can everyone have a clap, a virtual clap for those teams? On Auckland Blue, we have Isaac, Quinley and Grace. And on Auckland White, we have Frederica, Millie and Jack. So again, clap to all of those speakers. The motion that we'll be debating is a topical one, and it is that assuming that a vaccine for COVID-19 would take 3 to 4 years to be developed, this House would prefer a reopening of New Zealand's borders to the current approach that's been taken. Sweet, so that's the motion, those are the teams. The way it's going to work is we've got, I think 5 have made it, lovely chairs who are going to be introducing each speaker. They've all claimed a speaker each to introduce. The chairs for this tournament have been the ones operating the live stream. For those at home, these are the ones that you want to be thanking. And I believe that the first chair who's going to take over now to introduce the first speaker of the affirming team is William Price.
Kia ora, everyone. It is an honour and a privilege for me to be able to introduce the first speaker of the affirmative team from Auckland Grammar School, Isaac Mellisglin.
Can everyone hear me all right? The approach of elimination where we have a border closure is unsustainable. It is hurting New Zealanders' mental health. It is meaning that businesses are failing, and it's meaning that the government is spending money that will put the country in debt for decades upon decades. We on Side Affirmative support liberating the New Zealand economy and the New Zealand people from a failed approach that will not work if a vaccine doesn't come for 3 to 4 years. What do we support in today's debate? 2 things. Firstly, reopening New Zealand's borders to all countries. This is opposed to only opening them for NZ citizens, which is the current model. What does this look like? 3 things. Firstly, all individuals that arrive in New Zealanders will be tested. Secondly, they are put into a quarantine facility, which they have to pay for 1 day. Thirdly, if they test negative, they are able to enter New Zealand, but if they test positive, they will either be able to go back to their country or pay for quarantine until they have a negative test. Second part of our model. This policy will be paired with a change in New Zealand's focus from elimination to suppression, which countries like Taiwan and South Korea have both adopted. What are the key features of this approach? 3 things. Firstly, increase in contact tracing and domestic testing. This looks like adopting Ben Morgan's COVID-19 card for contact tracing, which will make it a lot easier. Secondly, promoting good hygiene practices like hand sanitizer and wearing masks, to work overseas. Thirdly, not having regional lockdowns when we find cases, but rather working to quickly isolate those infected and get past the initial infections. What do we envision our New Zealand looking like? More people coming to New Zealand and not many cases getting through the border, but us being able to rationally manage those that do with a policy of suppression. 3 substantives for the House today. Firstly, why a reopening of New Zealand borders will dramatically improve the New Zealand economy. Secondly, why this policy will not lead to significant health harms from COVID-19. And thirdly, Kunle will split telling you why we avoid changing between alert levels when we change our approach to COVID-19. Firstly, let's take a look at why reopening New Zealand borders will dramatically improve the New Zealand economy. 3 reasons for this. Firstly, we tell you that international tourism in New Zealand rebounds. Crucially, tourism in New Zealand is largely dependent on international travellers from places like China, from places like Southeast Asia and Europe. Under the status quo, international tourism is at 0, as no non-New Zealand citizens or permanent residents are allowed in. Why does this change under our side of the house, and why will tourists necessarily come in droves when we open the border? 3 reasons. Firstly, because the process to come into New Zealand is easy. There's no huge quarantine period if they test negative. Secondly, we tell you New Zealand always has been a large tourism sector, and it makes sense that we still keep trading on our brand image of being like a green country that people want to go to. Thirdly, we tell you that particularly during COVID-19, New Zealand is seen as a safe haven, so as a good option for families who want to go and travel. What does this mean at the end of this? It means that we have tourism operators in New Zealand that now get enough money to keep going, because domestic tourism is simply not enough for your hotels, for your holiday park operators. Crucially, this also means that New Zealand's balance of trade improves, and we avoid a devastating current account deficit that's going to require us to keep borrowing and borrowing, because we require exports to offput our large current account deficit. And when we lose tourism, our biggest export, that's going to have huge repercussions for the New Zealand economy. Second part of the second point, we fix labour market shortages that are arising from having no migrant workers. Because we tell you, industries like fruit picking and construction rely on bringing in workers on temporary visas from overseas. This is because New Zealanders either don't have the skills to do it in cases like construction, or New Zealanders just don't want to do it, and we have to outsource this labour in cases like fruit picking. On our side of the house, we allow orchards and construction sites to actually operate at full capacity and bring in revenue to these producers and the New Zealand economy.
Isaac.
Final part of this, we get international students back into schools and universities. It's important to note here, panel, that New Zealand educational institutions are so reliant on international students which pay higher fees. What that means is that when we don't get any international students coming in, they struggle, and either the government has to prop them up, or they fail and school boards run large deficits and put them in very difficult situations. We fix this by allowing international students who see New Zealand as a safe haven to come in when we reopen the border. Why are these economic impacts so important and will win us the debate? I think it's important to note here, firstly, that this policy will be for 3 or 4 years before we get a vaccine. So all of those economic benefits are times by 365 by 4, because that's how many days we're going to have these in for. Secondly, they're so important because of the mental health of New Zealanders, because the economic impacts of COVID-19 had devastated New Zealanders' mental health. We need to get it back on track by providing New Zealand businesses with revenue, by providing New Zealand educational institutions with students. Thirdly, we tell you we put less pressure on government to continue to provide financial support, because we think things like the wage subsidy won't be as necessary when we actually have an export sector for things like tourism again. Either the government can reduce the debt that we endure, or we can put it in other areas like helping New Zealanders through welfare payments who were actually laid off. We are so proud to benefit New Zealand's economy and New Zealand people. I take it POI.
Okay, so you can talk about the economy all you want, but the incubation period for COVID-19 is 14 days and contact tracing is poor. How do you protect the hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people who have immunodeficiencies or the elderly in New Zealand from COVID-19?
Okay, a few responses to this. Firstly, we're happy with policies like keeping rest homes, like security around them, relatively strict. Under our side of the house, this is what countries like Taiwan have done. Secondly, we tell you on our side of the house, we improve contact tracing like countries like Taiwan have done with a suppression strategy. And thirdly, as I'm going to go on to explain in this point, we don't think that there'll be significant health harms of this policy. So why is this policy going to not dramatically cause any big outbreaks? 2 reasons for this. Firstly, the people coming into New Zealand are unlikely to have COVID under our side of the house. Why is this? Because in our policy, we clearly set out that if they are symptomatic or if they test positive, they won't be allowed into New Zealand. What does this mean? It means that if they feel symptomatic overseas or were from a very high risk area, they are unlikely to travel to New Zealand as they'd risk enduring a huge financial cost of staying 14 days in quarantine, which they have to pay for. They're likely to get a test beforehand in their own country. That's just a sensible, easy measure that they can take. But also just because of the idea of social responsibility, if they think they're high risk, they're unlikely to want to take that to New Zealand and risk the lives of New Zealanders. Secondly, we tell you this isn't likely to cause a huge outbreak in COVID because good hygiene practices, masks and contact tracing will prevent any cases that do come in from getting out of control. Why is this? Two reasons. Firstly, because there'll be improved public buy-in when the economy gets going again. Because we think people are really opposed to things like masks at the moment because they're suffering, because the government has been ineffective in its response and is crippling New Zealand's economy. We changed that. But secondly, the government can now implement better policies and systems as it has experience with COVID and an understanding of the virus. We promote a pragmatic response, so proud to be on Team Liberation in today's debate.
We're just going to pause. One of the members of Auckland Blue have just had a bit of internet connectivity issues. So Grace, if you can go ahead and just restart your Zoom.
Yeah, I'm going to leave and then rejoin and then like force quit my Zoom because Isaac dropped out for about 30 seconds during that speech for me.
Awesome. While we're doing that, we might as well introduce the judges. I was going to leave it till the end, but it seemed like a good time. Chairing the debating panel, judging panel, sorry, today is sitting next to me, Maddie Nash. So well done, Maddie from Wellington. Next we have Sebastian Templeton, also from Wellington, in the bottom left on my Zoom, but give everyone a wave, Seb. Oh, they can't see you actually, it's been to speak of you. Next we have Umba Santu from Auckland. Then we have Emily Partridge from Otago and Andre Castaigne from Kaharangi Marlborough. So well done to all those judges. And thanks to all the other judges as well that have judged this tournament. We have excellent high quality judge pool and you're seeing the best of the best right now.
Okay, I've just force quit Zoom and reloaded. So hopefully that works.
As one of your chairs for High School Nationals Debating 2020, it is an honor and a privilege to introduce the first speaker for the negating team representing Rangitoto College is Friederike.
Panel. In April, New Zealand spent 7 weeks locked into our homes to protect our kids and our grandparents from needlessly dying. At the point where Side F want to open our borders, they are completely wasting this effort. But more than that, they are forcing us into either people being in endless isolation because they keep getting sick or dying en masse. And we simply cannot stand for a policy that is going to risk New Zealanders like this. What are we going to prove to you in today's debate? We are the side that best protects the health and the sense of security of New Zealanders. That is our top priority. But how are we going to do this? We obviously stand for keeping borders closed in the current system as AFID have outlined, and relaxing this only on 2 conditions. Firstly, once a vaccine is developed and distributed, and secondly, if the global pandemic just completely stops. Furthermore, we continue to support subsidies to those businesses who are most significantly hit. This wouldn't look like the complete wage subsidy, but maybe those most affected in the tourism industry. So 3 points for the House today. Firstly, why this would completely risk the health of New Zealanders. Secondly, how on our side we get stronger Kiwi communities. And thirdly, why this is logistically impossible. But first, let's take a look at what AF have told us today. Some of my rebuttal will be integrated.
On that point,
All, I'd like to mention just how disconnected from reality some of their health policies are. They told us firstly that people would love to come to New Zealand because it's so safe, but then that in self-interest, they're more likely not to do this if they feel like they were going to be at risk. But secondly, they also told us that people are just going to get tests beforehand and be super responsible. We tell you that it's in human nature fundamentally to think that you are going to be exempt from this, to undervalue the risk to your life, and also the fact that tests are just unpleasant and that people don't want to go through this because they think that there is no need, particularly if they're not feeling unwell at the time. We just won't see many people doing this. Secondly, they also wanted to tell us about how they're the side who best protects mental health. But at the point where they're also willing to completely isolate people in rest homes, we tell you that their mental health is simply not going to be promoted in that case. And we also tell you that the sense of fear that comes from having so much more COVID-19 in the community is far more detrimental to people's mental health, particularly in a world where we see that increasing online access is happening. Yeah.
Man, there'll be a huge financial cost for the individual who either has to pay for their plane ticket home or 14 days of quarantine if they test positive when they come to New Zealand. Why wouldn't they just take the simple step of testing in like Vietnam before coming to New Zealand?
Look, on both sides of the house, people are going to pay for this isolation. That means that wealthy people are going to do it. To these people, we don't see that it is that significantly worse, particularly if they think that they aren't affected, because they are not going to think that if they're not symptomatic and if they haven't been in contact with someone who they know has COVID-19, in which case they probably wouldn't be flying anyway if they think that they're going to be unwell on that trip. The people who are going to be people who think they are fine because they don't want to be sick on that trip, so they wouldn't get this testing. Secondly, though, they wanted to tell us a whole lot about the economy. And let's just note that we only have to minimize this harm because we think that at the point where people are literally dying, the economy is probably secondary. Firstly, they told us that borrowing is going to be super bad. We tell you that New Zealand has good credit, we can repay this, and that we would also be willing to stand for continued funding of international students and probably have more political capital. But let's move on to my substantive case then. Why do we protect the health of New Zealanders? So both sides broadly agree that a whole lot of people are going to come into this country. What AF are telling us is that 1 day of quarantine, which is completely less than the 14-day period, is going to simply catch all of the cases. We tell you that at the point where people aren't in managed isolation for this length, every person coming in is a threat to the safety of New Zealand. We already see that firstly, people can leave this, but secondly, that the health system will be completely overloaded. And these are all issues that are exacerbated when we increase the scale. If one person gets coronavirus, if that one person goes to a mall, goes to a church, then we get completely further a spread of these to many people in the country. And we tell you this is necessarily going to happen because the people coming are tourists who want to travel to a whole lot of places. They're young. They probably want to meet a whole lot of people. Why is this then different if we keep our borders closed? 4 main reasons here. Firstly, the people coming in are New Zealanders. That means they fundamentally have more of a sense that they have a duty to look after other people and the like. Secondly, we tell you that the burden isn't that big. Actually, there's such a limited number of people coming in, and the number in managed isolation is going to decrease significantly over time, that we simply don't have more people who can get the virus coming in. Thirdly, we tell you that these people have more broadly a cultural connection to the area. If you're coming home to see your grandmother, you probably are going to take every precaution, and you're probably not going to travel throughout the whole country. Fourthly, though, we tell you that New Zealand citizens simply know how to reach out for help more. If you're a tourist who has put so much money into planning your trip, firstly, you probably don't want to sacrifice that by then making it clear that you have COVID-19 and needing to be isolated and losing the money you've invested. But secondly, you might not know how to actually reach out for help. What does this mean then? At the point where AF are seeing multiple outbreaks, series of these over 3 to 4 years, we see people's grandparents in rest homes dying because they are visited, or the many who aren't in rest homes and simply cannot be protected through their policy. At the point where they don't even want to stand for lockdowns, we see these outbreaks spreading beyond households. We see kids missing more school, which is in fact far more detrimental to these schools than not having international students. And we see the health sector becoming further overstretched, which in turn leads to further debt of the kind that they precisely wanted to avoid. They don't get any of their benefits on the side, but we promote health. Secondly, then, why do we strengthen New Zealand communities? What we've seen is that COVID-19 has posed unique risks to the economy and to our social ties. But these are things that keeping our border closed fundamentally is able to fix. Let's look at these two key issues then. Firstly, on the economic one. We tell you that New Zealand is not, as they wanted to argue, going to go broke from keeping our borders closed. We tell you that global trade of the likes like agriculture can still happen, and that there is a lot of domestic flights. What we see is that New Zealanders in New Zealand who are wealthy and maybe now can't plan their international trips are more willing to go to places like Queenstown. And that's something we've already seen with the amount of domestic flights that increased before the last lockdown. We tell you that at the point where these people are likely to visit tourist attractions, they are in fact going to be better than the people that AF wants to let in. Because wealthy tourists coming from overseas, firstly, are not going to be visiting the struggling places. They are only going to be going on like a massive tiki tour around New Zealand, not the regions that actually need it. And secondly, because these people are fundamentally more likely to be able to engage. Secondly, though, we also tell you that this domestic trade is exclusive because at the point where so many people are coming into the country, there is a greater sense that there is a social threat, that everyone around you could have coronavirus. And that might be the difference between cancelling your family roadie to Gisborne or actually going on that. So we tell you that domestic trade is something we only get on our side of the house. Comparatively, though, they get people going to some limited groups. Very briefly, then, we also tell you that on their side, we're feeding a sense of distrust where everybody could have COVID. This further stigmatizes the virus, but also worsens domestic racism of the like that we saw at the beginning of the outbreak with harmful things being said to people who look a bit foreign. What do we get on our side then? A better health response, a better economic response, and a safer New Zealand. Proud to negate.
Right on that speech. Before we get the next chair to introduce the next speaker, can all the judges please turn your videos off, and also all the speakers that are not currently speaking, unless Grace, you've dramatically improved the quality, then we can keep them on. But if not, probably best to keep it off. Okay, yeah, everyone. Cool.
So just for POI, should we just unmute ourselves and turn the video on, or?
Yeah. You can even just not turn the video on, you can just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Frederica, for that excellent speech. I'd now like to invite up the second affirmative speaker of Auckland Blue from Kristen School, Kunli Zhang, to continue his team's case.
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
What the negating team today has failed to engage with is the fact that we have access to the wealthy whales coming in from China, coming in from South Korea, who are willing to spend much more than the domestic tourists living in New Zealand. And these tourists coming from China and South Korea are not the ones visiting rest homes, are not the ones going and visiting their grandma in New Zealand, but rather the ones who are going to Queenstown, the places that are struggling, and injecting a lot of money into those struggling communities. That is the benefit we have on our side of the house, and they haven't sufficiently engaged with that. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, what are the effects on COVID-19 and on health? Secondly, what happens to the economy? And thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about a really important point about why their system of elimination causes yo-yoing between alert levels and why this is particularly harmful. So firstly then, let's talk about the effects on COVID-19 on health, because they told us that, well, our current system already lets people a 14-day quarantine means that people still get in and spread the virus. Why is this analysis not relevant in this debate? Firstly, we told you we stand for a broad change in the way that New Zealand is combating COVID-19 in comparison to the status quo. We gave you at Isaac a clear picture of the types of restrictions that would be put in place. This looks like things like more strict enforcement rules of wearing masks, more strict enforcement rules of contact tracing. These are all the types of things that mean that people are less complacent in their behavior when they are interacting with others in New Zealand. I'm going to touch on that more in my split. We tell you that means that even if we do have marginally more people getting through on the borders, it means that our reaction time is a lot more quick. It means that we're able to isolate those individuals much more quickly than in the status quo. That's an important point in this debate because we mitigate a lot of the material then about people getting through, and we still claim the massive economic benefits. So secondly then, they want to tug at the heartstrings by talking about the elderly and how they were particularly at risk in this debate. Look, we happily stand for the restrictions that already take place in rest homes, in vulnerable communities. Those types of restrictions still exist on our side of the house. But secondly, we tell you it's probably symmetric on both sides of the house. The people visiting rest homes are presumably the people who are still going to visit rest homes on our side of the house. That's a symmetrical harm in this debate. So then, moving on, they then talked about fear and mental health, particularly in these vulnerable communities. Look, we tell you the comparative in this debate is your mental health when you see your community in Queenstown and your family struggling to put food on the table because there's no tourist money coming in, versus maybe you're not sure,
on that point.
you're not sure in the community, there might be some risk of transmission, but you're wearing a mask and there's contact tracing taking place, the government is taking care of that. That's on one side, we have a pretty 100% guarantee that you're going to face economic harms that literally mean you might not be able to feed your family, versus this minor risk that we know that we're able to we know that we're able to confront using systems that we see in Taiwan, systems that we see in South Korea. That's important because it means that the mental health that exists in this debate is a lot worse on their side of the house. People are much more stressed out when they don't know when their money's coming in, when they don't know how they're going to pay for their rent. That's important in this debate. Fourthly and finally then, they told us about how New Zealanders are more responsible than international tourists. That means that people are going to that means that the health outcomes are worse than our side of the house. Look, if anything, New Zealanders are probably much more complacent than international tourists. This is because New Zealand just has this broad confidence about the way that we've handled COVID-19. That means that that New Zealander coming back from another country is much less likely to obey the 14-day quarantine period and just go visit their grandmother because they're familiar with their grandmother. They think they're are familiar with their country. They think that they're okay. They think they can get away with the rules. That doesn't happen for international tourists because they probably come from countries where they have seen much more dire effects of COVID-19. They know the risks much better than many of the New Zealanders living in New Zealand do. That's important in this debate. The harm of New Zealanders is probably much worse than international tourists. Before I move on and talk about the economy, I'll take a point. Okay, so, oh yes.
If it is necessarily true that some people are going to come in and those people are are perceived as not culturally Kiwi, why then are people actually going to go out and engage in the economy and not lock themselves down and freak out?
No. Firstly, the international tourists coming here are tourists, right? They're going to go and spend money. They see New Zealand as this safe haven. I'm going to touch more on this in this point. And they see New Zealand as this great tourist economy. They're going to go out and spend that money. Not sure what you're trying to get at in that point. Okay, so what happens in the economy, right? Because they told us people won't come, people are not going to engage with the economy. This is just incredibly problematic analysis. Firstly, we tell you that wealthy tourists like whales coming in from China are exactly the type of tourists who just want to like take a break from the whole situation of COVID-19. They want to come to New Zealand, which has been in international headlines. They want to come here, relax, and spend some money. This is important analysis in the debate, because those are the wealthy people who are going to be spending like exorbitant amounts of money at Sky City and exorbitant amounts of money in Queenstown. That will never happen for domestic tourists, because domestic tourists are like facing economic downturns right now within New Zealand. They're unsure about this, like they're like facing economic uncertainty. Secondly, then, we also tell you that it's like tourism is also broadly a lot cheaper right now because of the COVID-19. That means we're like, as a country, we're much more attractive to international tourism. People are much more likely to come here and spend some money. Secondly, and finally, the thing about international, like domestic tourists going to like struggling regions, we're not sure what this means. Like the struggling regions are presumably the regions who are tourism. When we increase international tourism, those are the regions that will receive injections. Not sure what they're trying to get at here. Okay,
On that point,
about why system of elimination causes yo-yoing between levels. And this is something that we've seen like in New Zealand. This is something that has happened. We've experienced this. And note here that this is their best case scenario, because either they support us just being like level 3 or 4 for like 3 years, or they support like this type of yo-yoing behavior. Okay, so firstly, we tell you that by nature, elimination strategies that like the ones we're currently employing in New Zealand create complacency. What does this look like? This looks like school kids hugging and kissing and like interacting with each other without enforcing social distancing when it's announced that we have like big fat zero on the news. This looks like nobody's social distancing and wearing masks because we think we've like accomplished the task, we've solved COVID-19, the problem doesn't exist anymore. That happens in elimination strategy because we think that we've solved the problem. Secondly, we tell you also governments also want to get down levels as quickly as possible because they know that being at like level 4, at level 3 has significant economic impacts. That means they're going to try and get us down those levels as quickly as possible. Why is this particularly problematic? Firstly, we tell you that elimination causes yo-yoing unless we can guarantee we can test the entire nation confidently. This causes uncertainty for businesses who can't plan for the medium long term because they don't know if in 2 months there's going to be like another cluster that pops up and that's going to push them back into level 3 or 4. That means that they're not able to make medium long-term plans. They're not able to plan for their business and make those types of decisions. Secondly, we tell you that there's particularly large problems in mental health because you don't know if like in the next week or so we're going to be like pushed up to level 4, if we're going to go back down to level 3. That type of like uncertainty creates huge emotional and mental health strain. This looks like things like debating competitions being cancelled, rescheduled, cancelled, and then rescheduled again. That creates significant like psychological harm and creates significant pressure within communities and within groups of people within New Zealand. So what's the comparative then? Because our side of the house goes for a more measured and pragmatic approach, where we do things like regions like Taiwan or countries like South Korea have implemented. We have a consistent approach where people know what's going to happen in 1 or 2 years is going to be what's happening right now. There's no uncertainty. They know what's going to happen. That's important analysis in the debate. So at the end of this point, we are the side that minimizes and manages COVID-19 health effects. We're the side that gets the economic boost that we need. We're the side that prevents yo-yoing. Extremely proud to propose.
Cool. We thank the speaker for their speech, and we now welcome the second speaker from the negating team, Millie Coe from St Cuthbert's College, to continue the negating team's case.
Can you hear me? I just want to do a quick sense check on that absolutely bonkers case that we've heard from first and second. The idea that New Zealanders are going to be perfectly happy with opening our borders and letting literally anyone come in after 1 day of quarantine. 1 day of quarantine, which is like scientifically shown to not catch nearly enough cases of COVID-19. 1 day of quarantine, which New Zealanders who have spent months in lockdown are going to feel totally betrayed by. They can't get that under their side of the house. We tell you there's going to be massive backlash. People aren't going to support their policy in the same way they're going to. They're just going to shut down and impose their own kinds of non-government sanctioned lockdown. What am I going to do in my speech? First of all, I'm going to briefly talk about how New Zealanders are likely to react to this kind of policy and the trust they have in their government. Second of all, I'm going to talk to you about the critical health impacts that Side AF was too keen to downplay in this debate. Thirdly, I'm going to discuss briefly on the economy. And then fourthly, a substantive contribution about why this is going to be an absolute logistical nightmare to actually implement in the first place. Firstly, on how people realistically perceive the government under their side of the house. We tell you that narratives surrounding COVID-19 and New Zealand's response was all based on this idea of a team of 5 million, of us making a collective sacrifice to help our grandparents, our children, and our children's children. We tell you that's really crucial because people see their ability to act freely in society as necessarily part of a sacrifice that they personally made. What do we tell you? First of all, we tell you that New Zealanders are probably going to feel like they're totally kicked up the arse after people can come into this country without making a similar or symmetric sacrifice. We tell you 1 day in quarantine is not nearly enough. This will invoke senses of nationalism as they perceive their government to have betrayed them, to have betrayed a national sacrifice that was made. But critically, we think people just aren't going to trust the individuals that come into the country. We tell you material about people saying that like, oh yeah, the foreigners are going to get tests, is just totally untrue. And even if it is true, New Zealanders won't perceive it as such. They'll think these are people that are coming off to free ride off their big efforts and essentially lock down because they don't perceive this action as something that is in the best interest of their health. At the end of this, we tell you the government isn't going to be trusted and the response isn't going to be followed or believed in. That's critical because even if all their benefits are true, we tell you New Zealanders just aren't going to engage in the economy. They're going to freak out and they're going to stand against and protest their governments. Now, critically, onto the health impacts of the debate. This is the material I think is critically most important because unlike Side AF's just like tendency to totally downplay this, we think that is the whole point of every COVID response around the world. We tell you the government has an impetus and an obligation to look after first and most the lives and the public safety of these people they call their citizens. Why is this necessarily true that we get better health outcomes for the people of New Zealand? 5 crucial reasons. First of all, just how does COVID-19 work in the first place? Because Isaac seemed pretty keen to just implement this like 1 day lockdown period. A couple of reasons it isn't going to do much. First of all, most COVID cases are asymptomatic for about 14 days. That necessarily means that you can, even if you do get the test they were talking about, get the test, fly into New Zealand, get tested again, and then be free to roam around the community. Crucially, because a lot of people are going to be particularly young, are going to go out and socialize massively with a bunch of people because you're a tourist who you probably can't remember the names of, you probably didn't write down where you went, and then spread massively through the community. Then it's going to ripple out and out and out. That's particularly bad. Second of all, we tell you the tests themselves aren't always positive. You have massive amounts of false negatives under our side of the house just because of how medical testing necessarily works. We tell you that you need a 14-day quarantine period necessarily to do this. Then they told us that people coming into this country are going to act in a particular way. They're going to get a test before they come, and then they're going to be particularly respectful of New Zealand rules. First of all, we tell you that when Side AF opens up the opportunity for people to pay for the 14 quarantine, to pay for the capacity to quarantine within the country, as they modeled out in the introduction, we tell you people are probably just going to do that. They're going to take the risk, and they're going to come and be willing to pay for that. Crucially, we people who are coming are probably already going to be somewhat wealthy. They're going to be willing to take this risk because they're already taking time off work. They're already like moving halfway across the world for probably quite a few months. Secondly, additionally, the opportunity cost is quite big. Even if it does mean they have to pay for a flight home, the risk, like the possibility of being in a country without COVID probably sounds quite appealing to them, even if that's not true. Second of all, people are just irrationally non-skeptical about their health. People believe they're far healthier than they naturally are. We tell you these people broadly also don't care much about New Zealand culture. As they told you, they don't care about the people around them. They don't have any particular social ties. Comparatively, people that come back onto our side of the house, probably coming back to like visit family, particularly dying relatives, they're going to take additional risks as they really respect their family rather than just like respecting people they've never met before. Thirdly, they told you the stuff on complacency. We tell you what's going to happen is something far more like the US. What happened in that country? They said a corona spiraling out of control. They saw the government, they didn't trust the government's response to that. So they essentially just went out, oftentimes went maskless and didn't really care. We tell you that's the reason they had massive spikes in California. We tell you if you feel the government doesn't have your back, you're not going to be more vigilant. You're either going to lock down or you're just not going to not care and become a massive nihilist who's like, I'll just get COVID anyway, it doesn't matter. Then briefly on mental health, we tell you that the effects of locking grandparents in rest homes for 3 to 4 years is massive. The effects of just like totally isolating immunocompromised people is massive. Their side of the house is going to lock down every individual who's at risk for 3 to 4 years. That is ridiculous, panel. You are going to destroy those people's capacity to have meaningful social relationships. I'm going to go briefly onto the economy in about 2 seconds, but I'll take a POI now.
Ma'am, how do you think all of the hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who are involved in tourism, education, and industries like orchards, which require migrant workers, feel about the government actually allowing them to operate?
Okay, we think they're going to feel pretty good on our side of the house once they recognise the government cares enough about them to give them reasonable subsidies, as they're doing right now. We don't think we should care about how those people feel. Briefly, how does this impact spending? They said a bunch of rich people are going to come in and spend. First of all, those people are only going to really come to like the really wealthy hotels in Queenstown. You're not going to affect the many numbers of like medium businesses which cater to the middle class. You're only acting as a subsidy to wealthy people wealthy businesses because only wealthy people are coming in. You still have a bunch of businesses that are left behind because middle class tourists from Australia probably can't afford to come. Crucially, we tell you that Kiwis are just going to stop spending, which massively reduces this beyond what they wanted to tell you. Then they told you at Isaac that it was unfair to make Kiwis pay for potential subsidies in the future. Thankfully, this was dropped by Kunli because it was quite ridiculous. We tell you that Kiwis, because they recognise the sacrifice that is being made by certain industries, they are willing to cover part of the cost in the form of higher taxes. This is broadly popular right now. We think the wage subsidy has been a broadly beneficial skill. We're willing to go into a bit of debt if that's what it costs. Then at the end of this, they told you that what's going to happen is when a yo-yo between levels. We think it's reasonable to assume this won't happen. As we were told when Auckland went into lockdown, this would be one of the last, as they've massively expanded their contact tracing thing, which means that if there's tiny regional outbreaks that happen like once every couple of months, they can deal with it. Also, we tell you we would rather that than being in a constant socially imposed lockdown. Briefly now on why this is a total logistical nightmare. I want to tell you very briefly, thousands of people are flocking to New Zealand every day as they were so keen to stand behind the massive costs involved. Because even if only 1 or 2 people each day come in with COVID, that means 1 or 2 people more every day who have to have specifically catered contact tracing regimes. Why do you think that number is so reasonable of like 1 or 2 out of 1,000? Because of the numbers we've seen internationally, because like 5 million people have it in the US. A lot of those, probably about 10 times that apparently, who haven't been diagnosed. Crucially, what we tell you is you're going to be spending massively on contact tracing. We have very limited public health infrastructure in this country due to our size. We tell you it is not fair for us to like totally waste those resources. It's going to be a poorly run operation because of how spread out these resources are going to be. It's going to be a poorly run operation in these hotels because you tell you that public health officials become despondent, think an outbreak is going to happen anyway, and just not put any resources into keeping those people in those hotels safe for that one night. Crucially, this means the operation is going to fall apart, people are going to become despondent, and you're going to have a US-style outbreak. That's bad for everyone in this country, even for the economy.
We thank the speaker for her speech. And now it's my privilege and honour to invite Grace Chang from St. Kentigern's College, the third affirmative speaker, to conclude the substantive portion of our team's case today.
Panel, unfortunately for the negating team in today's debate, this debate doesn't take place in the exact world that we live in today. This debate takes place under the assumption that a COVID-19 vaccine will only be ready in 3 to 4 years. That's the comparative that we have to engage with, and we don't think it's enough for the negating team to tell us that it's fine for the government to just continue subsidizing all of our dying industries for the next 4 years. Our credit rating is never going to be good enough to ever recover from that kind of government borrowing. And the world we exist in is simply not a world where a vaccine may or may not exist in the next 3 months. Two major points of clash for the House today then. Firstly, what are the economic impacts of this? And then that flows on to how that affects mental health. And secondly, what are the health impacts of this? So let's begin by discussing the first point of clash around the economic impacts. The next response here was simply to tell us that, hey, firstly, we don't care about the economic impacts. And they tell us that New Zealand has good enough credit ratings that they can fund universities, that they'll rely on domestic travel to prop up our dying travel industry. Well, as I told you in my introduction, unfortunately for the negating team, it's not enough for them to just say that none of this matters on economic impacts, no thank you, because this debate is fundamentally going to be a way up. We think the negating team lives in an idealistic world at the point at which they tell us that none of the economic impacts have to be considered when there are COVID impacts. So it's not enough for them to just decide that across two speakers, they'll give us about 30 seconds of economic impact that relies on government will continue to subsidize these industries. So what do we say that the economic impact actually looked like? Firstly, we gave you extensive analysis around how this changes tourism. They told us domestic tourism was exclusive to their side. We tell you it's not exclusive to their side because within a 4-year period, until a vaccine is found, you're likely to have people who want to travel. But secondly, we tell you that when New Zealand realizes that a suppression strategy works, as it has in South Korea, as it has in Taiwan, then they travel because they don't want to be randomly stuck in lockdowns. They don't want to have to go through an elimination strategy that gives them no certainty around their finances. We tell you that people only, even New Zealanders, are only likely to be able to take on the burden of going traveling when they have stable incomes, at the point at which they don't know if they're going to end up in Wellington and then suddenly be stuck in a lockdown where they have to pay hundreds of dollars to stay in hotel accommodation for periods of time that they thought were longer than they could budget for. They're not going to want to travel. We tell you then, what's our comparative? We tell you that we get international tourism, and it was never enough for them to just tell us that domestic tourism replaces the international tourism. It's a simple stat that international tourism is New Zealand's largest export industry. Domestic tourism is never going to be able to replace that. We told you that the people who come, those international tourists who come, are likely to be people who spend money, who are rich, who are wealthy, and who are likely to spend that money. We tell you they are going to spend that money in struggling places, because the places that are struggling the most are the ones who have been hardest hit. It doesn't matter if they're a hotel, because even if they're rich hotels, they're still struggling right now because they're the ones losing out the most revenue because of the situation. Thirdly and fourthly, we gave you responses around international students and labour market shortages that they didn't have any response to. And we think that this is incredibly important and crucial in today's debate. At the point at which our universities, international students, our universities collapse, our education systems collapse, Auckland University will never be able to be seen as a world-class university when they've worked hundreds of years to get their rankings up to where they are now. We don't think it's okay to say that we'll simply subsidise these universities, because it's necessarily true that if the government could have subsidised them to that extent without needing international students, they probably would have already done so already. On labour market shortages, we didn't hear any response. We think that this is strong material that still stands. We need those people to come in and work for our economy. Then let's discuss whether or not it's feasible that the government could just continue to pay out subsidies and wage subsidy schemes or subsidise these businesses. They told us that our current credit rating was good enough for us to sustain extended periods of borrowing. We tell you that that's simply not true. We tell you they can't assume that a vaccine is going to be developed in 6 months, as the government is doing now, because that's not the world that this debate takes place under. We tell you that the political pressure that would exist on the government if they were to spend billions of dollars funding a wage subsidy scheme for 3 years would be enough for them to just kneel over and probably never be able to get back on their feet again. We tell you that if they tell us that we have limited public health infrastructure already, then we don't have enough money to subsidise a wage subsidy scheme for 4 years. We think it needs to start living in the reality and note that if this debate takes place in a world where a vaccine isn't developed for 4 years, there is no reasonable way that a government can continue subsidising the way that they have for the past 5 months. Okay, let's look at how this affects mental health then. As we've told you down the line, and as Kunle has extended on in his split, we tell you that mental health impacts are huge when you have uncertainty. We think that the level of uncertainty that exists means that people can't plan more than a month in their future. It means that people can't plan to have a debating nationals because it'll get cancelled 2 days before we were due to fly down. We don't think that's a world that anyone wants to live in. We tell you when you have constant lockdowns, you're never able to ensure that you're going to be with the people that you care about, that you're going to be able to have those relationships, that you won't randomly get locked in a house somewhere like hundreds of k's away from the people you care about because you're not allowed to move now. And additionally, it's pretty obvious that businesses can't sustain themselves under those kinds of conditions. What did we hear from Neg on this then? They told us that New Zealanders would just lock themselves down and then suffer those mental health impacts. We think that that's pretty indicative of the fact that they think that they're being pretty naive, because we just don't think it's true that every New Zealander can afford to lock themselves down. We think that they only think that because they're probably like rich people who think that living in lockdown is fine because they don't need to go out, because their businesses can sustain themselves without that kind of lockdown pressure. We tell you we want we want the people who need to get out to work and operate to have those things. They then told us that lockdowns were bad. Lockdowns of 3 to 4 years were bad for the elderly. We tell you it's bad for the general population. We think that the elderly are likely to stay in their rest homes, and we can put measures in place for rest homes. We think that if they think it's bad for elderly people to be in lockdown, we also think it's bad for the public to be in lockdown over and over again. I'll take a POI if you have one. No response.
Is it not necessarily true? Why is it not true that in a country where people are willing to sacrifice a bit more money in tax because they feel like they're a team now because of our response to COVID, that we're going to go into such significant debt for this?
Okay, the first response here, and I'm actually going to tell you this, is that we're losing public buy-in. We're losing the ability for people to happily contribute millions of dollars of their tax money into funding these kinds of things, as we've already seen from increased anti-lockdown protests. We think that there are people getting restless. So that's going to factor into my second point of clash around the health impacts. This was where Neg wanted to win the debate, and we'll tell you why that doesn't actually outweigh any of the economic harms that we proved extensively. We told you that people are likely to get tested before they come. They told us this wasn't true because they thought they were going to be fine. We tell you firstly that even if you're rich, you don't want to waste time. If you're rich, you probably want to do things with your time that matter to you, so you're not likely to waste that time or their money. Secondly, we think that if COVID-19 is out of control in your country, such as it is a huge risk for you to come here without being tested, you're unlikely to want to leave that country because you're leaving behind your friends and your family in that kind of dangerous situation. But secondly, we tell you that COVID responses require buy-in. When we already see anti-lockdown protests, when we see a huge increase in the number of people flaunting rules, because it might have been fun the first time around, you might have found it nice to sit at home and not have to go to school, but the second time around, you realize that it sucks. You realize that it means you can't do any of the things that matter to you. You realize that exams might be cancelled, that your businesses are going to crash. We tell you that public buy-in increases when you have an improved economy, when your government knows that your livelihood has to be sustained for you to ever be happy to give up time and money to buy into this effect. We tell you that it's simply naive for Neg to say that COVID doesn't exist in their world anymore, because we've seen time and time again that elimination doesn't work. It's never worked. We asked them to give us an example of a strategy in a country where elimination strategy has actually worked. They'll tell you it doesn't. The only strategy works is suppression. We're proud to stand behind opening our borders and propping up the New Zealand economy.
Thank you very much for that speech, Grace. It's my privilege to now invite up Jack Sanderlin from Auckland Grammar School to conclude the substantive portion of today's debate.
It is absolutely clear in this debate that the affirmative side of the House does not understand how COVID-19 works. Because what they failed to acknowledge is the fact that people can have a negative test on day 3, but develop those symptoms and become positive on day 12. That's like 50% of the cases in managed isolation right now. So when someone gets a test before they come, get here 12 hours later, and then have one test and they're gone after one day, there is still a large chance of them spreading COVID-19. They fail to deal with it, and they cause outbreaks, risking people's health. 3 main points of clash for you today. Firstly, how does this impact New Zealanders' health? That's the most important point in today's debate. Secondly, which side benefits the social outcomes in New Zealand? And then thirdly, how does this impact the economy? So firstly, onto this point about how does this impact New Zealanders' health? So they tried to tell us that this wouldn't cause outbreaks because people would be tested before they come. And we told you this was unrealistic because this was like painful annoying testing, and they don't think they have it, right? And then they told us a far more compelling line of analysis that they do it to avoid having to like pay for isolation. 3 responses to this for you today. Firstly, they may not have symptoms or have it when they're tested, right? They develop over time. This is huge amounts of the tests that are currently in managed isolation at the moment, right? Like you could be negative when you get tested and then you're positive a few days later. We think a load of these cases slip through the cracks. Secondly, and absolutely crucially, something they failed to acknowledge in today's debate was false negatives, right? There are false negatives with testing of COVID-19, and like none of this testing is completely foolproof, right? So we think that these cases also slip through the cracks when you only have one test and isolate for one day. On our side of the house, we avoid that because we have multiple tests. They cause lots more outbreaks and risk people's health. But thirdly, the wealthy people will simply take the risk, right? Judging on the evidence that it's painful and that they don't think they have it, will just be like, oh, I can't be bothered. I'm very unlikely to have it. And if I do, I'll pay for it, right? So their logic is like, there's a 5% chance I have it or 1% chance. And so I'll just take the risk. This means that they could have it and they could be bringing it into the country and they're just taking the risk anyway. That's a big incentive to act on people because loads of people don't want to get tested because they like simply think that they just don't have it. So then they told us that like tourists coming in wasn't actually that damaging, and that it was actually the people in New Zealand who are far more damaging, as they're like going to retirement homes and things like that. 3 responses to this for you today. Firstly, tourists are going to the most popular and populated places, right? Tourist attractions. That's where everyone wants to go. Places like Queenstown, which are already hugely populated with New Zealand people. And so we think this causes it to spread far more easily into a far wider range of people. Secondly, we think as characterized literally by the affirmative side, thank you for that by the way, is that tourists view it as a safe haven. So they're much more likely to be complacent because they view New Zealand as like a safe haven that's like COVID free and really good against COVID and way better than their country. So they're far more likely to just go around freely and be carefree and complacent. That's literally why they're coming to New Zealand in the first place, to get away from COVID. Thirdly, just because they don't visit rest homes doesn't mean there aren't huge harms. Let me walk you through this in today's debate. A tourist spreads it to someone working at a tourist attraction. That worker then goes and has dinner with their grandma. That then spreads to that grandma, and that grandma catches COVID-19 and is at a very, very large risk because of the affirmative's terrible policy. They then wanted to bring us contact tracing, and that contact tracing was like this brilliant thing that works 100% of the time. 3 responses to this for you today.
On that.
Many people don't use contact tracing, as we've seen in New Zealand, right? But barely like... Although we don't see people actually using contact tracing much and complying with this. Secondly, it's only useful after an outbreak, right, to actually trace where that person's gone. Damage is already done, particularly when they don't have a lockdown on their side of the house, so it can still spread to loads of people and loads of people catch it. But thirdly, it's done poorly in New Zealand, right? It takes ages to contact trace. This means that person could have been around and like been with many other people before they actually trace it. It could have consistently spread to others, right? And the people that caught it off him could have been around as well. What is crucial on this point is that they never contested that there would be at least some outbreaks every year. And at the point where there are, 2 to 3 big outbreaks every year, we think nothing else matters in this debate. We are putting so many lives at risk of not just the elderly, because recognize there's loads of people who have deficiencies who are also at risk in today's debate. So at the end of this point, they absolutely put health at risk. huge harm. Now moving on to the second point of clash, which side benefits the social outcomes in New Zealand? At first, they wanted to talk about mental health, but then they realized that they actually really harm mental health, right? Because this is because they realized they were keeping the elderly and the many with immunodeficiencies essentially trapped inside like a prison for 3 years, right? They said they would have high security on rest homes. Two responses to this for you today. Firstly, this is a huge impediment on their freedom, as we already told you. But secondly, many elderly aren't at rest homes, right? They're living at home. There's a huge amount of people who are at risk who are living at home, and they don't care about these people at all in today's debate. They also told us that there'd be huge backlash from the public, but there's actually huge backlash on their side because New Zealanders feel like they've given up a huge sacrifice, and this has been played up by the media and the government who have told us that we've given up this huge sacrifice in lockdown and told us that we're doing a great thing sacrificing a lot, right? Now, when people are coming in, New Zealanders see this as a threat to that sacrifice and a threat to that work, and this leads to more like domestic racism against like people who maybe like we saw at the start of like COVID-19, where people there's lots of racism against like Asian people, even though they were New Zealand citizens. On their side of the house, during an outbreak, what happens is the rich stay home because they can afford it since there's no lockdowns. They stay home and protect themselves, but the poor suffer because they can't afford to stay home. What does this do? This means all these people are pushed to catch COVID-19. People who can't pay for treatment as well. They can't handle having COVID-19 as well, and they can't handle it economically or health-wise. So clearly, they cause much worse harms for these poor people. And also, they then brought up like anti-lockdown protests and like buy-in is decreasing. This is completely ridiculous. I've literally seen a photo where there's about 5 people at the anti-lockdown protest. That's like a very small minority of people. Most of the people interacting with that page actually haters telling them that they were stupid. Now moving on to the third point of clash, how does this impact the economy? They told us that we greatly hurt the economy by not allowing international tourism. 3 responses to this for you today. Firstly, over 50% of the money for tourism comes from domestic tourism, right? They wanted to say that international tourism was so big, but domestic tourism is actually bigger in New Zealand. Secondly, the push by the government to support local will now occur in order to make sure the economy stays stable, as we've told you right down the line. But thirdly, the wealthy will go to Queenstown instead of overseas, right? That just makes sense. They've had their trips overseas cancelled, so they go to these areas like Queenstown. This is literally why Queenstown had an absolutely massive season this year and actually didn't suffer in their big skiing season this year because they had huge amounts of people domestically coming over. But importantly on this economic point, when you get more outbreaks on their side of the house, like we prove, the economy is way worsened because people are scared to go outside and buy things from the economy because they don't want to catch COVID-19. They then told us we can't cover for industries by borrowing and subsidies. Firstly, they were overplaying the harms here. But secondly, we were happy to increase taxes, as we told you down the line. Thirdly, we can borrow. The US is in heaps of debt and continues to be able to borrow. We have good credit. We are able to do this. But fourthly, we don't require total subsidies because internal trade still exists. So at the end of today's debate, not only are we the side that protects New Zealanders' health the most, but we also minimise the impacts on the economy and protect their mental health. Stand with the side that opposes the death of the people who are most at risk in New Zealand. Stand with side negating.
I'd like to thank Jack for that whopper of a speech. As is customary, we'll now switch the speaking order. So I'd like to invite up the negative reply speaker, Millie Coe.
In a debate, literally about life and death, it always seems a bit callous when Side Af tried to tell us their win strategy was literally the economy. Side Af is asking for you, as a New Zealander and your family, to sacrifice your children, your grandchildren, and your children's children. Also, New Zealand's national debt doesn't increase all that much. A choice that seems so deeply unfair to those with autoimmune diseases and those with elderly parents that it seems almost just on that they should lose today's debate. 3 areas of contention. First and most importantly, on health. Then on the economy, and thirdly, on the tangential social harms. Firstly, on health. We think First of all, we were able to pretty clearly prove in our case that there are going to be people, and lots of people, falling through the cracks, because there are lots of people that have COVID-19, most of whom are undiagnosed, and those individuals just won't get caught by testing. But what was their response to this? Because their response to this was essentially like, yeah, we can contact trace. Yes, we can fix things as things pop up. First of all, this concedes that there are going to be a quite significant number of outbreaks. We tell you these individuals, once they arrive to the country, because they see it as a safe haven, as improved down the line, are going to act in a way which would be indicative of someone that's just come out of months of isolation in somewhere like Vietnam and somewhere like California. These are people that are going to go out, they're going to party, they're going to travel throughout the country, socialize with as many people as possible. Frankly, their assertions that these people care about New Zealand or don't want to be trapped in a quarantine hotel don't deal with the massive fact that these individuals are just going to act totally irrationally and spread it as much as possible. Crucially, that as we told you, we don't have the kinds of contact tracing facilities that will ever be able to handle this kind of massive burden. We tell you it's going to be massively inefficient, and even if you can catch every person, it's going to take a lot longer to catch every person in today's debate. But crucially, why does this matter? This matters because we have family that is going to die, because every person is going to deal with the way, which means that they're going to suffer. That's critical in this debate, because we should just value human life above all things. The government ought to value human life above all things. On that material, we win, and they can never. Well, next, onto the economic harms, because this is the stuff they crucially wanted to win on. They told us that our side cripples the economy and that we can't borrow on it. First of all, literally the only things they could ever say was foreign fruit pickers won't be able to come to the country. Universities will have slightly fewer international students. And then thirdly, we have less tourists. We kind of destroyed their tourism point through the case. We are totally happy to continue subsidies. Crucially also, most countries, including the US, after the global financial crisis, went into significant government debt in order to cover those things. These are still countries that are able to reasonably borrow. They have reasonable credit. We think it's only 3 or 4 years. That is reasonable to the kind of additional spending we did after 2008. The kind of government spending we did after the 1970s oil shocks. We can cover these kinds of things. We were happy to stand for that. Additionally, we were happy to stand with tax increases. We told you why political capital was going to be behind that. Crucially, then they told us that international tourists, international students were going to be hurt. This covers under our increased spending on education. Additionally, we don't think it's that bad if a couple few international students come. We can focus those resources on domestic students. That's probably good in the long term. Then finally on fruit pickers, cool. We were totally happy to retrain current New Zealanders without jobs and under our side of the house. Additionally, those companies can sort of just raise wages and be done with it. At the end of this, we tell you what's more important for the economy is that people are not going to trust this government strategy. They told us that people would buy in because it means they have more freedom. We tell you because, as Freddie told you, they're diminishing returns and fewer people are going to come into the country under the domestic system. We're just not going to have any fewer outbreaks after 6 months from now. Crucially, that means you don't have outbreaks and you just let people spend as much as possible. The comparative is people freak out and hide away, or you have outbreaks. Then briefly on social harms, we brought you massive harms around mental health, about the effect that the elderly are going to be trapped in retirement villages for 4 years, about the fact that people, for instance, from Southeast Asia are going to be massively discriminated against even more. That's critical, and they don't have an adequate response beyond we don't care. We do, and that's why we're in today's debate.
Thank you very much to Millie for her reply. I'm thrilled to now invite up the affirmative leader, Isaac, to deliver the final speech of the debate and this year's Online New Zealand Schools Debating Championships.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. We never had to prove in today's debate that we were going to eliminate COVID and reduce any health risk, because we accepted right back in my first AF speech that some people would get through the border with COVID. However, what we paired our policy with, and what side NEG just failed to contend with, is that we have a policy of suppression under our side of the house, where we can use a measured approach with increased mandatory contact tracing with things like COVID cards, with increased mask use, with increased good hygiene practices to reduce the risk of a large-scale COVID outbreak. Importantly, also note, panel, that as much as SIDEF wanted to claim that we're like killing all New Zealanders, what they failed to contend with was that under their side of the house, they don't have a perfect health response either. Because as we've seen this week, elimination has failed, and it only takes one slip up at the border for something to occur. On our side of the house, we recognise that there will be some health impacts, but what we want to do is protect the mental health and revenues of New Zealanders and help us get through the next 3 to 4 years. Okay, 2 points for the House. Firstly, whether reopening New Zealand's border impacts the New Zealand's economy, and secondly, whether this policy improves the health of New Zealanders. Well, let's take a look at the economy. We told you right down the line that we have multiple benefits. The tourism sector now has international tourists, which spend far more than domestic tourists. The education sector will have international students, and primary industries will actually have migrant workers who can do these jobs. The only substantive response to this down the line was that we can just subsidise all of these areas of the NZ economy for 4 years. Why isn't this good enough? And note that I would have brought some of this material up in a POI, but unfortunately, Jack didn't take one in his speech. 2 responses why subsidies aren't good enough. Firstly, because subsidies only mitigate economic damage, because a wage subsidy doesn't fulfill the same revenue that a firm would already have. So there's still an economic loss, even if you're subsidising everything out of New Zealand for the next 4 years. Secondly, we tell you it's just unsustainable to offer subsidies long term, because eventually you lose political capital, you get into huge debt, and the government can't spend money on other areas like welfare and health because we're propping up struggling Kiwi businesses. Why is this point so important in today's debate? Not only the standard of living of New Zealanders improved, but the mental health of Kiwis improves when they've actually got stability, when they've actually got certainty. But crucially also, this directly responds to their public buy-in material, because as we said right down the line, you get public buy-in and get public support when the economy's working, when people actually have jobs and can put food on the table. Second point then, let's take a look at whether this policy improves the health of New Zealanders. Because we said, just on the economy alone and the effects of that, that is a huge mental health benefit to New Zealanders, not putting them in lockdown when we change to a suppression strategy. That is a huge benefit that they can't play down. They had a couple of claims. Firstly, they told us that we're sacrificing the lives of New Zealanders in some really emotive rhetoric, but don't buy that for 3 responses. Firstly, because we said we're having a measured response of suppression where we can have contact tracing and masks. We don't buy that this will lead to us being the next US. Secondly, we told you right down the line that people coming in are unlikely to have COVID. Look, sure, some of them might be self-interested narcissists, but we think that the majority of people are good people, don't want to leave their family dying at home if that's the situation in their country, don't want to risk the lives as New Zealanders. And thirdly, we just say they don't solve COVID on their side of the house either, so some of the health harms are symmetric. Then they told us that we're effectively sentencing those in rest homes and the elderly. Firstly, let's just do a sense check on this, because we never said we're going to lock them down for the next 4 years. They can still visit, they can still go on walks, but it just means that we're not allowing tourists into these rest homes. Secondly, we tell you that if we compare restrictions of a nationwide lockdown versus slightly more restrictions on rest homes, we think that it's far better to for the former, because we don't want the whole country locked down again following some policy of elimination. I said 8 speeches ago that we are the side of the house that is team liberation. We're fundamentally the same team. Let's liberate the New Zealand economy, and New Zealand is.
Thanks so much for that debate, everyone. And everyone virtually give both teams another round of applause. The judges are going to go and deliberate and join their own Zoom call. And while we do that, we've got a couple of speeches to have. The first is from Christopher Bishop, MP for Hutt South. Chris is a long-standing stan of the New Zealand debating community. He was a member of the Wellington regional team back in high school, then made the New Zealand team, and since then has both been a coach of the New Zealand team, a chief adjudicator of nationals, and the president of the New Zealand Schools Council. He's also a life member of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council, so we're really happy to have him. Chris was meant to be hosting this in Parliament, and while we're now hosted on a web server in California, we thought it was appropriate for him to come and talk to the students and to everyone watching. So give a virtual round of applause to Chris.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me, Sam?
Yep, you're good.
Fantastic. Sorry, I had a few issues this morning on the parliamentary call. Well, great to be here and I suppose I would say host you virtually, but that's not really even the case. But if this was the normal nationals at 2 o'clock on a Monday, I'd be hosting you in the Legislative Council chamber of Parliament, which is a job that I greatly enjoy doing. So sadly, we are not there due to circumstances everyone knows about, but hopefully in a year or so's time, we can get back to being in Parliament and everyone being together, because Nationals is a very special time for many people in a particularly prestigious and august competition and organisation. So can I just firstly say congratulations to all of you for making it into the various regional teams and making it to Nationals, at least virtually. And I know that you will have had a extremely stressful time over the weekend, sitting in front of your computers debating. And although you haven't had the fellowship and the camaraderie of being together like you normally would at Nationals, staying in the hotel and spending time at the Victoria University of Wellington Law School and being able to debate together in person, I hope that you've at least experienced some of the joy of Nationals, at least virtually. And I particularly congratulate the 2 Auckland teams for making it to the grand final. I do have to say, when Sam told me that it was Auckland Blue versus Auckland White, a little part of me died. The fact that Wellington wasn't in the grand final, but that's the way things roll. And obviously, Auckland's had a bit of a banner year, so congratulations to both of the Auckland teams for making it through to the grand final. Debating is something that you'll have all have heard the speech before from people about how debating teaches you skills that you can use at university, and it teaches you how to argue, and it teaches you how to write essays, and it teaches you about the value of ideas and debate. And so I won't repeat that speech, which if the Governor General was here, and in normal years at Nationals, we have the Governor General along to Parliament, and various Governors General in the past have given you a speech like that. So I won't belabor the point other than to reiterate all of those things, which are of course true, but I just make the simple point that I think debating is more important these days than probably ever before, but not just in New Zealand, but also around the world as well. The response that we must shape as a community to the ravages of COVID present questions that will have an intergenerational impact, and the decisions that this generation makes in the next few years and in the next few months will shape the rest of our lives. It will certainly shape the rest of my life, and it will almost certainly shape the rest of you who are competitors and your children as well. And the world's never really known a challenge like this, at least since World War II in an economic sense. And so the decisions that we'll be making as a community in New Zealand, but also around the world in the next few months and years, will have a huge impact on the way in which we live our lives. And the questions that are presented are challenging from a public policy point of view, and they're challenging from an intergenerational moral point of view as well. And what that will require from people in decision-making positions, and I'm sure that many of you watching and listening who participated over the course of the weekend will be in those decision-making positions in the future, because there's one thing that you know about debaters is that typically they are the most talented and erudite and intelligent secondary school students in the country. and I'm absolutely convinced that that is the case this time around as well. But what decision makers will have to grapple with are some pretty complex public policy challenges, weighing up all sorts of invidious trade-offs that maybe in past years decision makers have not had to weigh up. And what that will require is perceptive insight, challenging preconceived ideas and notions, and of course the ability to thrash out issues in a robust and considered, but also respectful way. And of course that is exactly what debating teaches, and exactly the values of debating that we hold so dear in this organisation. So I think debating is going to be more important in the next few months and years than probably it ever has been. And of course, in New Zealand, we're about to have a extended community-wide debate in the next few weeks. We thought it was going to wrap up on September the 19th, but it's going to go a few weeks longer to October 17, another 29 or so days, and we're going to have an extended public debate in our country about what our response to COVID should be and what the right things to do in the future are. And of course, we are a long and unbroken democracy for over 150 years. And again, if we were in the debating chamber or in the Legislative Council chamber at Parliament, I'd be pointing over to the left and pointing out the debating chamber, the actual debating chamber at Parliament, and pointing out the significance of where the final of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championships is normally held every year, which is at Parliament, the home of free speech and the home of debating in New Zealand. But sadly, we can't do that on this occasion, but I hope we'll be able to return to it in future years. So can I just, in closing, congratulate you all once again for making it through to the Nationals Grand Final, making it through the Grand Final, but also making it through to the weekend. It's a significant achievement to come to the National Championships. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. And can I also just say thank you to the conveners of the championship and also the New Zealand Schools Debating Council for organising this. Haven't been involved this year because of obvious reasons, but been involved for many years in the past, going all the way back to when I was a competitor myself back in 2000 and 2001. And I think I've done almost every job in the book when it comes to this tournament. And I know that it's a huge amount of work that goes into putting it together and making it a fantastic weekend for everyone. Maybe slightly less work over a virtual competition, maybe not actually. I'm not actually sure how it's been pulled together, but a huge amount of work behind the scenes. And of course, the coaches do a huge amount of work for all the competitors as well. And I know that all the competitors, you will be very grateful to your coaches, all of whom, many of whom are very experienced debaters in their own right and adjudicators as well. So this is a fantastic competition, one that I'm very proud to be associated with. And hopefully next year we'll be back at Parliament and back at Vic in Wellington, and hopefully with a bit less time pressure on for me, I'll be able to be around and maybe adjudicate a few debates next weekend or next year. So thank you for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be able to say a few words, congratulate you all, and looking forward to hearing who won.
Awesome, thanks so much for that. So not only do we usually have a speech from a guest speaker, usually Governor General, we also often have competitors who have debated at the championship to give an overview of their weekend and I guess have a fresh young perspective of what's happened. So we're going to do that again over Zoom. The first competitor you're going to hear from is Thea Morton from Hawke's Bay.
Although it wasn't the tournament we'd originally envisioned this weekend, I would like to thank everyone who made the past 3 days an epic second nationals to be a part of. Hawke's Bay has a pretty limited debating program, so getting to be a part of the regional team these past 2 years has been an incredible opportunity. The intensive coaching that comes with being part of a regional team has meant that our team has improved exponentially, going from 2 out of 7 wins last year to 3 out of 5 this year. More than the improved statistics though, the chance to build on our skills and to become better debaters has been invaluable. And this is all down to the amazing coaching that we've had this year. So I want to take this chance to thank Brooke and Rebecca for all of their hard work and dedication to coaching us since we were initially selected in February. Both of you have been so supportive and have never failed to bring the hype before and after every debate. Thanks for organising the many Zoom training sessions and for busing or flying to Hawke's Bay to train us in person. And here's hoping by next year one of you will have your full licence and be able to drive here. Thank you and well done to all of my fellow competitors over the past few days. And I want to take this opportunity to especially congratulate the 2 Auckland teams on making the final. Thank you to the chairs of each debate and to the judges for your consistent and high quality feedback that have allowed us to keep improving over the course of this tournament. Finally, I want to thank the conveners, Sam and Meg, for organising the Debating Nationals for 2020. The work that initially went into organising our in-person nationals, and then the hard work you did within such a short time frame to make sure we still had an opportunity to debate is so appreciated. Nationals this year and last year has been such a highlight of high school for me, and I hope that in the future I can continue to be a part of this amazing tournament.
Awesome, thanks so much for that, Dia. And next we have from one of the Wellington teams, Isabel Scherf. It seems that Isabel might not be on the call yet. In that case, we might go to Lucy from Canterbury, if you're on the call, Lucy.
Last year, when I got a message saying I've been picked as a reserve for the Canterbury team, I had to refresh my Facebook Messenger about 7 times before I could even believe that it was true. Sitting here now, having actually debated at Nationals, I'm so grateful that I did get that.
Competitions, tournaments and school balls have been cancelled. Being able to debate at Nationals.
Sorry, you go, Lucy. Sorry, Izzy, you had cut out there. So we'll do you third. But you continue, Lucy.
Okay. Sitting here now, having actually debated at Nationals, I'm so grateful that I did get that opportunity, because debating has, while kind of taking over my life for the past few months, also been something I've gotten so much enjoyment out of and learned so much from. Though my own Nationals ended up being just slightly different than I imagined, it's still been absolutely awesome. Making the switch from real life to Zoom was actually surprisingly easy, even though our coaches didn't seem to be able to figure out how to put us into breakout rooms. Out of level 4 and reinvigorated, Team Canterbury set up in my living room with the trusty ironing board out to put the laptop and papers on, and started practicing in earnest in the lead up to the online selection event. I was honestly very scared to be picked for the online New Zealand team, especially since I would be debating with the very intimidating Aucklanders. I was pleasantly surprised that they were actually very nice, even if they tried to make me run principal points, as was the entire team. Even though we went to Masterton, which, to be honest, was not quite the same as Mexico, I was so grateful to be able to do an online Worlds, getting to debate teams from Romania, Nepal, Japan, United Arab Emirates, and more. I even made a friend from Singapore who I still talk to today. Being in the somewhat strange position at having debated at an online Worlds but not at Nationals yet, I was more excited than ever to get rid of the Zoom and offer POIs in person. And so when I got a message saying that Jacinda was holding a press conference in 15 minutes, my heart dropped. I was so worried that Nationals would be cancelled, but the organisers pulled a truly superhuman effort in moving us online, even making sure we didn't miss out on the quiz. Nats this year has been an absolute whirlwind, but also so much fun, and I know I've become a much better debater for it. Before I finish up, I just want to say a few quick thank yous to all the people who have made Nationals so awesome. Firstly, thank you to the amazing conveners Meg and Sam, Zach and Jenna, and the rest of NZSDC for organising for this all to happen and giving us the opportunity to debate. This year, I imagine, has been a lot more stressful than the past, but you've been so flexible and organised. This has definitely been the smoothest Zoom tournament I think I've done so far. Thank you for all the adjudicators for volunteering your time to help the tournament run, and to all the chairs for spending your weekend watching us debate and running YouTube live streams. Thank you to all the coaches for dedicating so much of your time to Zoom practices. When you signed up, I'm sure you didn't anticipate still coaching us in mid-August, so thank you, we all appreciate it so much. In particular, I'd like to say thank you to Will and Vickers for being sources of endless Canterbury pride and an endless stream of inspirational NBA videos and high frequency trading matter. Also, a massive thank you to Sam and Shakid for coaching the New Zealand online team, who, true to the afternoon stuff quiz yesterday, really were the best coaches we could have asked for. Finally, thank you to all the teams that we've debated against and the ones we didn't get a chance to debate against. I made so many new friends through debating this year, both in my team and members of other teams, and I know we'll keep in touch in the future. New Zealand Schools Debating is such a welcoming and fun community, and I'm so glad to have been a part of it. Thanks so much.
We're back, take two. So in a year when competitions, tournaments and school balls have all been cancelled, being able to debate at Nationals 2020 has been an absolute highlight for myself and I'm sure for all of the contestants around New Zealand. We've seen some super high quality debates this weekend, and actually COVID has made this experience even richer because we've been joined by hundreds of people via live stream. But what I'm aware of is, amongst lots of complex cases and fancy words, a lot of our YouTube fans might not have had as much debating experience as the very talented teams we've seen today. So I thought it'd be good to just have a quick rundown of how to debate. You know, after the final, better late than never. First, you need an intro. It's good to start with an example of something super emotional, like the way students across New Zealand crumbled as we discovered round 2 was going to be a sports motion. You should also talk about how you're going to win the debate. So for example, in this speech, by proving that despite a crazy year, we were still able to pull off an amazing nationals, and I know we're all so grateful for that. Then you move on to your first substantive, and in this case, that was the great and powerful Zoom. We faced some ups and downs on Zoom, including but not limited to the experience we had about 3 minutes ago, chaotic POI offers, passionate speeches started on mute, and the knowledge that this house, a UBI. But thanks to the amazing work of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council and the building blocks set in place by Aotearoa Online Schools Debating, we were able to pull it off. Thank you so much to everyone working behind the scenes to convene an online tournament and to keep the tech running. In particular, I want to thank Sam, Meg, and Jenna for all of their hard work. Then you take on your second substantive, and in my case, that is the quiz. We were still able to pull off a phenomenal quiz, minus a few controversial questions, but it was clearly the most important part of Nationals, despite it being completely online. And also despite it being completely hijacked by a bunch of law students and policy analysts who've clearly spent the last 5 years studying quizzes, not torts. Despite those students' blatant cheating, we still owe a huge thank you to the volunteers and coaches who supported us. These people spend their valuable time with a bunch of 17-year-olds and their knowledge and expertise is invaluable. A special shout out to the Wellington Gold coaches, Sam, who was very iconic and wrote very factually correct bios, and Jodie, who literally coached us between meetings with Ashley Bloomfield to save New Zealand from coronavirus. Wellington had 2 less months of training than everyone else this year, but Sam and Jodie and Tam and Ailey from Wellington Black didn't let us drop the ball, and we've had just as great an experience as ever. We love you guys, and your advice of don't lose debates was very amazing. Another huge thank you goes to the chairs who wrote and ran one of the most chaotic quizzes I've ever seen, as well as the live stream that connected all of us. Now you have your final substantive, and in my case, that is my fellow debaters. Debating really is one of those semi-sports where you come for the challenge of public speaking and you stay for the people. While we didn't get to meet in person this year, we were all definitely able to connect as teams across Aotearoa. And between post-debate chats and Facebook groups, we were really able to create that experience. The standard of debates goes up and up every year, and I know I'm surrounded by the future leaders of New Zealand. I can't wait to see where you guys go. At the end of the day, even when we take Corona at her best, we were still able to have an absolutely phenomenal Nationals. In this speech, I have shown that not only are we so grateful for the amazing people who worked tirelessly to ensure we could have Nationals, but we had an amazing time doing it. And that is why this house is proud to be just a small part of New Zealand Schools Debating Nationals 2020.
Awesome. I'm just going to go down and track down the chair of the panel, Maddie, who had popped off to a different room in our Wellington base in order to make her decision and confer with the other judges. So hold on for a couple of minutes before we start the prize giving. We're just a couple of minutes away. They're just finishing up the discussion now.
Good everyone. So I'm back here to announce the result from the grand final. So as the debate, well, you will have all just seen the debate, and an excellent and really high quality debate between Auckland Blue on the affirmative and Auckland White on the negative. Congratulations, first of all, to both teams for making it this far in the competition and for treating us to such an excellent debate on a very relevant topic to our lives at the moment. So congratulations, another round of applause for you all. Do a silent round. The debate was very close, reflected in the fact that the panel was split 3-2. But ultimately we awarded the debate to the affirmative team, Auckland Blue. Congratulations. I'll pass you over back to Sam, who I'm sure will continue with proceedings.
And I'll pass you over to Zach, who will then continue with proceedings from there.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the New Zealand Schools Debating Championships prize giving. A massive congratulations to both finalists and ultimately to Auckland Blue for taking it out. Just for proceedings today, we're going to run through the speaker awards, so the announcement of the New Zealand development team, highly commended speakers, members of the New Zealand team, and then some final speaker prizes. The first team that we're going to announce is the New Zealand development team. This is a team of speakers who are in year 12 or under, who will come together to help for training and development, and may also participate in potentially an online tournament at the end of the year. The members of the New Zealand, there are 5 members of the New Zealand development team. The first member of the New Zealand development team is Andrew Q from Waikato. The second member of the New Zealand development team is Jack Sanderlin from Auckland. The third member of the New Zealand development team is Mia Perkins from the Central North Island. The fourth speaker of the New Zealand development team is Julia Randerson from Wellington. And the fifth and final member of the New Zealand development team is Emily Horsfall from the Hawke's Bay. So a massive congratulations to all 5 of those speakers. There are a number of really impressive younger speakers here at the tournament, and it was an incredibly difficult time for the adjudication core to select that development team. The next set of speaker prizes that we'll announce are highly commended awards. These awards go to students who the AdCore thought had excellent performances over the course of the tournament. The first highly commended award goes to a speaker you just heard, and that was Isabel Schiff from Wellington. The second highly commended from the debate you just saw from Auckland is Frederic Voigt. The third highly commended goes to, from Kahurangi Marlborough, Ronan Thompson. Congratulations once again to all those speakers on their achievements. We now move on to the announcement of the New Zealand Schools debating team. The New Zealand Schools debating team will receive coaching from the New Zealand coaches and will hopefully represent us at an online tournament also towards the end of the year as well. The first member of the New Zealand Schools debating team from Otago Southland is Isabel Fraser. The second member of the New Zealand Schools debating team, and you just saw him in action in the grand final from Auckland, is Isaac Mellis-Glynn. The third speaker on the New Zealand Schools development team, who you also heard from earlier today from Canterbury, is Lucy Jessup. The fourth speaker from the New Zealand Schools development, in the New Zealand Schools debating team from Auckland, who you also heard in that grand final, is Millie Coe. And the fifth member of the New Zealand Schools debating team for 2020 from Northland is Ronan Payenda. A massive congratulations to all of those speakers on their selection, and we're sure they will do us proud. We now move on to the final section of this prize giving, which is the most promising speakers of Nationals for 2020. Oh, sorry, the most promising speaker, the first award is the most promising speaker of Nationals 2020. This goes to a speaker who was in year 12 or lower, who we thought was the most promising speaker at this tournament, and that award goes to Ronan Payenda from Northland. The second award or position that we'll announce is the captain of the New Zealand Schools debating team for 2020. The captain of the New Zealand Schools debating team helps lead the team and is a presence for bringing that team together. This award goes to, from Canterbury, Lucy Jessup. The final award to award today is the award that goes to the best speaker of Nationals for 2020. The best speaker of Nationals for 2020 is from Auckland Blue, Isaac Mellis-Glynn. A massive congratulations to all those speakers and everyone who competed at the tournament. Finally, as part of this prize giving, we need to move into thank yous. There are an extraordinary amount of people who come together to make this tournament happen. The first that I'd like to congratulate, I think, all of the people who have volunteered to make this tournament happen. So firstly, to the chair people who've done an amazing job helping broadcast these debates to hundreds of people across the country, and also to our conveners, Sam O'Grady and Meg Longley, who have helped run an exceptional and seamless online tournament. The second set of people that we'd like to thank is all of those who have helped make the coaching and the debating at this tournament possible. So a massive thank you to the judges for judging this weekend, and for the coaches who have spent the last 4 to 5 months coaching speakers right around the country. Finally, I'd like to thank the Adjudication Corps for making this tournament possible, Jenna, who was the CA, Seb, Joe, and Maddie for their efforts. I'd now like to hand over to Sam O'Grady for some concluding remarks. Sam O'Grady is the incoming president of the New Zealand Schools Debating Council.
Awesome, thanks, Zach. And I also just want to pay recognition to the work Zach's done. Not only has he been one of the deputy chief adjudicators of this championship, he's also largely been behind all the Zoom rooms that you've been debating in. He's been behind the finances, and he's been a huge backer and driver of this tournament and its move to online. That's now everything done for this year's Nationals. We just want to thank everyone for making it such a seamless and well-run event, right through from the chairs all the way through to the debaters. And yeah, hopefully in the future we'll be able to see each other in person. But until then, we've now got a really well-oiled machine of online debating. So if we can't see you in the future physically, we'll certainly see you in the future virtually. So thanks to everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.
Oi, Zach.
We're still live.